Indigenous rights. Everybody comes from somewhere, especially within the African setup. Everybody hails from a community somewhere across Africa, across all the countries in Africa. And I can tell you for sure that companies especially companies, agro companies and mining companies, maybe oil and gas is still under mining, you find that those companies, they interact a whole lot with the indigenous people where those minerals are located and where the resources basically reside. What happens within the interactions between communities and the companies in question? What are some of those key indigenous rights that usually go violated and those communities necessarily don't have the manpower or the mind power or the financial power to begin to wrestle their rights while these companies carry out business, while they're in the business of making profit and they are focusing on that in the interest of their shareholders and other stakeholders? I would share a story. There's a community somewhere in Edo State in Nigeria, and I think the chief in that area gave out a massive expanse of land to a particular company to do business in the community. He gave out land beyond his own reach, and at the end of the day, these members of the community, they were deprived of their livelihood. They couldn't go to the farms anymore. They couldn't do certain things anymore. And, there was necessarily no plan in place to be able to cater for the needs of this company as a result of the chief of that community giving out so much land, much more than the company actually needed in the first place. And you can be very sure what would have happened next. A lot of, I wouldn't say violence, but a lot of some semblance of a conflict, making it even difficult for that company to operate within that particular space. So you look at indigenous rights, like the right to land, for example. In some cases, there may be certain thought processes around the access to water. Companies carry out certain activities or actions that pollute the water that these communities have access to for drinking and for other purposes. So this is really something that companies must deeply reflect about. Beyond the fact that it's a moral question, it's a question of morality, it could also be a question of law, a legal question. At what point, to what extent can companies go in their operations to destabilize the use of land or the right to land and the right to water of the communities where they operate? So it's key, it's important. Companies, through having carried out a due diligence, the company carried out a human rights due diligence, especially in terms of their operations within communities, they would definitely find out that a lot of rights would emanate that these companies must basically adhere to. And when they fail to do some of these things, still boiling down to the last video where we talked about accountability, where companies know that they need to do certain things and they fail to do those things, the legal mechanisms must work. The non-legal mechanisms must also work. And there must be room for remediation. Community members should have that opportunity to say, we've lost this much. Company A is responsible. Company A must take responsibility for their lack of discretion in carrying out certain actions, profit orientation-based actions that now negate the human rights of the individuals in those communities. Indigenous people majorly suffer a lot, especially due to access of influence or access to influential persons, maybe in government, and a lot of other things that happen. Poverty is one of them. That's why the SDGs, for example, is something that a lot of countries, especially countries in the third world, developing countries, must take very seriously. When you have countries that really want to ensure that the SDGs are taken to another level, you would now realize that, okay, in terms of education, people are receiving better education. That means they have better information. They are better aware of the activities that companies carry out that infringe on their rights. Imagine if companies just go on, on a hell wash. They wash the entire place, with their dirty influence in that particular sense, and they carry out activities not necessarily caring. And it may be that people may necessarily not even know that what these companies are doing is totally wrong because they do not have the information. They are not necessarily aware. These are things that happen in communities that are majorly poor. You would also find out that in terms of maybe government infrastructure, you will not find a lot of government presence in some of these places. So even when people are shouting foul in a very deep forest, will they be able to generate as much temperature to have the attention of government to come to protect them, or to also put in place prevention mechanisms that prevent companies from going to the extreme in terms of having to satisfy their shareholders? So it's important. If you are in a location, for example, where you are very sure and you're convinced that the rights of the indigenous people in the community is being violated by companies, you can reach out to NHRIs in your country, that's National Human Rights Institutions. You can lay those complaints. Those complaints will definitely be investigated. During the investigation, parties to the complaint may be invited to come and share their own story. Then further monitoring can take place. In Nigeria, for example, the National Human Rights Commission has more of quasi-judicial powers. So those powers can further be engaged in the interest of indigenous people, in the interest of indigenous communities. We should not have communities where businesses would definitely overrun. They overrun them. They tilt the balance of scale against businesses that have existed over a very long period of time in those communities. That has to stop. And for that to happen, everybody needs to do their part. There needs to be a process through which people can make these complaints. Those complaints can actually be heard and acted upon by human rights institutions across various countries where there is really not much protection for indigenous communities. I feel that when we begin to talk about this, a whole lot more, you would really find out that there's a whole lot of damage going on across a lot of developing countries that have been bedeviled by the impact of colonialism and all of that. Much of all of this reorientation is required for people to have that change of mindset, a change of the mindset, mind frame, and for communities now to begin to request and demand for their rights. Sometimes government may necessarily not be able to crisscross all the nooks and crannies of countries, but it's also the duty of indigenous communities to raise their voices. Where you notice that infractions are going on, do not keep quiet. Let your leaders not go behind the scene to cut deals and negotiations that will be detrimental, to the mass of people within that particular community. Communities must start to speak up for themselves. When you begin to speak up, the world will listen to you, and therefore we can hold companies accountable in their actions within indigenous communities.